The Walsh family seemed like the epitome of success. Anna Walsh was the type of woman who appeared to have it all, intelligent, ambitious, and loved by those who knew her. She had a career as a regional manager at Tishman Speyer, balancing life between two homes in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. Her smile lit up every room, and to the outside world, her life with Brian, her husband of 6 years, was a picture of perfection. The couple had 3 beautiful children, and their life seemed idyllic, the kind everyone envied. But perfection is often an illusion. As the Walsh family gathered around the dinner table for New Year's Eve, the cracks in their seemingly flawless facade began to show. It was a quiet gathering. Anna, Brian, and a friend of Brian's, the only guests. There was something in the air, something unspoken, but no one dared to address it directly. Anna's laughter didn't come as easily as it usually did. Her eyes, once filled with energy and warmth, seemed clouded with a hint of sadness. Brian, on the other hand, was unusually distant. He sat at the head of the table, but his attention was diverted. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of his glass, while his eyes never quite met Anna's. It was subtle, but there was tension. Anna glanced at her phone, checking a message, then quickly putting it down as if hiding something. A flash of discomfort passed across her face. The night stretched on, but the warmth of the holiday seemed to fade. It was as if the clock ticking toward midnight was not counting down to a new year, but to something far more ominous. Brian's friend, who had been silent for most of the evening, made a comment about how good it was to see Anna so happy. But Anna's smile didn't quite reach her eyes this time. She nodded, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. At midnight, the obligatory cheers were raised, and the family exchanged polite words of goodwill, but it felt hollow. In a fleeting moment, Anna stepped outside to make a quick phone call to her mother, sister, and maid of honor. It seemed trivial at the time, but looking back, it felt like a farewell of sorts. The phone calls went unanswered, and Anna returned to the warmth of the house, but something had shifted. The tension in the air thickened, a palpable unease hanging over them. Anna stood for a moment by the doorway, looking at her family. Her gaze lingered on Brian, who had already turned his attention to his phone. The disconnection was obvious. She knew it, and he knew it too. Something wasn't right, and it had been building for some time. As the night wore on, Anna's unease turned to restlessness. She walked toward the stairs to check on the children, pausing briefly at the top of the staircase. Brian's voice followed her, distant and almost absent. "I'll be fine," he said, as if trying to reassure himself more than her. Anna didn't respond immediately, but something about his tone sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, catching his eyes for a brief moment. It was a look that was both empty and calculating. In that brief exchange, Anna seemed to know things would never be the same again. The house fell into an eerie silence once Anna went upstairs. A heavy stillness settled, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The evening ended without ceremony. The clock struck 2 a.m., and by then Anna had already retired to bed. The next morning, on January 1st, 2023, Anna would disappear. Brian's story was simple. Anna had left early for Washington, D.C. to deal with a work emergency. But as investigators would later learn, the simplicity of Brian's explanation was just another layer of deception. The truth, as it always does, would emerge, but not before it shattered the perfect image they had worked so hard to build. The morning of January 1st, 2023, was supposed to be like any other for the Walsh family. The new year had just begun, and the festive haze of the previous night still hung in the air. Yet, as the day unfolded, something was amiss, something that would never be explained in a simple way. Anna Walsh was nowhere to be found. Brian, still groggy from the night before, claimed that she had left early for a work emergency in Washington, D.C. Her flight had been rescheduled, apparently a sudden change of plans that required her immediate departure. He explained that she had just slipped out quietly, as she often did when her work demanded her attention. But something about this story didn't sit right. Anna's phone was turned off, and no one had seen her leave the house. Her bags weren't packed, and nothing about her departure seemed urgent or well-prepared. There were no signs of her usual travel routine, no flight confirmation, no receipts, no indication that she had actually gone anywhere. Brian's account was shaky at best. His explanation was simple, but not one investigator would buy it. What was more troubling was that Anna had called her mother, her sister, and her maid of honor the night before. The calls went unanswered. Did she know something was about to happen? Was this an attempt to reach out before disappearing for good? At first, the authorities were slow to respond. A missing persons report was filed by both Brian and Anna's employer, Tishman Speyer, but the early stages of the investigation were frustratingly vague. The first lead came when investigators discovered that Anna had indeed booked a flight to Washington, D.C. on January 3rd, but the record showed no evidence of her boarding any plane on January 1st. As the hours passed, the family and the police grew anxious, and the air grew thick with suspicion. Could she have left on her own? Had she fled? Or had something more sinister happened in that house? It was later in the afternoon when a breakthrough came. A neighbor, who had noticed Brian acting strangely in the hours after Anna's disappearance, came forward. The neighbor had seen Brian pacing around the house, looking nervous and checking his phone obsessively. At one point, the neighbor recalled seeing him leave the house in a hurry, his hands trembling as he got into his car. Was he trying to cover his tracks, or was he simply anxious about his wife's sudden departure? By now, the police had begun to notice inconsistencies in Brian's story. His vague answers, his inability to provide concrete details about Anna's departure, and his overly rehearsed explanation all painted a troubling picture. But the real turning point came when Brian mentioned the trip to Washington. Investigators were unable to confirm any meetings or emergencies that would have required Anna to leave so abruptly. She wasn't scheduled to fly for another 2 days, and there was no evidence of any urgent work-related matter. As the investigation deepened, the story started to unravel. The house, once a home filled with laughter and love, now stood as a place of mystery. Had something gone horribly wrong in those early hours of January 1st? The police were no longer simply looking for a missing person. They were beginning to suspect something far more disturbing. Anna Walshe had vanished without a trace, and the questions that began to circle around Brian Walshe grew louder. What was the truth, and what was Brian hiding? The narrative Brian had painted began to disintegrate as the investigation shifted into high gear. The truth was closer than anyone realized, but it would take a closer look to reveal what had truly happened in the quiet home of the Walshe family. As the days passed, the investigation into Anna Walshe's disappearance started to gain momentum. But the more the police dug into Brian Walshe's story, the more the cracks began to show. At first, his explanations had seemed harmless. After all, who would question a man's word when his wife was missing? But as the details began to pile up, his version of events grew more fragile, more improbable. Brian's first claim, that Anna had left for a work emergency, was now being scrutinized. Investigators quickly realized that no one in her company had any knowledge of such a trip. Anna was scheduled to fly to Washington, D.C. on January 3rd, but there was no record of her having boarded any flight on January 1st, as Brian had suggested. This was the first major contradiction in his account. The police began to press him on the inconsistencies. Where was Anna? Why hadn't she used her credit card since January 1st? Why hadn't she contacted anyone? Brian's responses grew increasingly defensive, and his demeanor began to shift. The calm, collected exterior that had fooled so many was starting to crack, revealing a man who was far less composed than he had appeared. A crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place when surveillance footage from nearby stores was reviewed. Brian had claimed he'd gone to CVS and Whole Foods on January 1st, but the footage from both locations told a different story. There was no record of Brian being at either store, and his alibi was falling apart. Brian was starting to unravel, but what truly sent shockwaves through the investigation came next, a discovery that would change the course of the case entirely. A neighbor, who had been suspicious of Brian's actions after Anna's disappearance, came forward with a key piece of information. This neighbor had seen Brian leaving the house on the morning of January 1st, looking frantic and acting nervously. The sight of him quickly driving away from the house raised serious concerns, especially since no one had seen Anna leave. The neighbor's statement was damning. If Brian had left the house and Anna hadn't, it suggested that something had happened inside the home. The investigators quickly shifted their focus from a missing persons case to a potential homicide investigation. The tension in the case was palpable. Every lie Brian had told seemed to be unraveling one by one, like a tightly wound thread falling apart. He had claimed that Anna left willingly, but the evidence was pointing in the opposite direction. No one had seen her go, no one had heard from her, and no one, it seemed, had any idea where she had gone. Brian was becoming the prime suspect, But as he was questioned more and more, his responses became more erratic, his explanations more strained. The investigators could see it in his eyes. His guilt was becoming impossible to hide. But they needed more than just suspicion. They needed proof. As Brian's web of lies continued to collapse, the investigators began to focus on the house itself. They knew that whatever had happened to Anna, it had occurred there. The quiet suburban home that once seemed like the picture of family life now stood as a dark symbol of the horrors that had unfolded behind its doors. The investigation had shifted. What had once seemed like a simple missing persons case had now escalated into something far more chilling. The stakes had never been higher, and with every passing day, Brian's guilt seemed more and more undeniable. But the most unsettling part? Brian's refusal to admit the truth. The deeper they dug, the more he clung to his fabricated story, and the more it became clear that he wasn't just lying about Anna's disappearance. He was hiding something far worse. The investigation was growing tighter, the evidence more damning, but one discovery would serve as the catalyst to shift the case into overdrive. It was on January 2nd, 2 days after Anna Walshe's disappearance, that Brian Walshe's actions took a darker turn. On the surface, his story still seemed plausible. His wife had left for work, an emergency trip to Washington, D.C., but now his words would be contradicted by an undeniable piece of evidence that would leave him no room to escape. Surveillance footage from a Home Depot in Rockland, Massachusetts, painted a troubling picture. Brian had visited the store that day, and the items he bought weren't the kind you'd associate with routine errands. He'd purchased over $450 worth of cleaning supplies, heavy-duty garbage bags, bleach, gloves, and other items that would make anyone pause. Why would a man whose wife had simply left for a work trip need such an assortment of cleaning materials? The investigators were quick to piece together the timeline. They had already learned that Brian's alibi was crumbling. He had claimed to be visiting stores like CVS and Whole Foods, but the security footage didn't align with his story. No one had seen him there. But now, the Home Depot purchase raised the stakes even higher. It wasn't just that Brian's statements didn't add up. Now, the evidence pointed to something far more sinister. When questioned about the purchases, Brian gave the same vague answers. He claimed that he was preparing for a renovation project at home, though no such project had been mentioned prior to his sudden shopping spree. He seemed defensive, almost too defensive, and his behavior was starting to show the strain. He repeated his story about Anna's departure, but with each passing day it was becoming harder for anyone to believe him. As the investigation team reviewed the store footage more closely, they noticed something even more chilling. Brian was alone, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor. His body language was tense, his hands shaking as he loaded the cleaning supplies into his car. It was the kind of nervous energy that didn't match a simple trip to buy supplies. It suggested urgency, fear. The detectives were now certain of one thing. Brian was hiding something. He wasn't simply lying about the details of Anna's disappearance. He was concealing something far more horrific. The next phase of the investigation took on a new urgency. The police decided to expand their search of the Walshe home. What had once seemed like an ordinary family home now appeared to be the site of a gruesome crime, and in their search, they found more disturbing evidence that matched the purchase at Home Depot. The basement of the Walshe house had become the focal point. It was there, in the same area where bloodstains had already been discovered, that investigators would find something they had hoped they'd never have to uncover. A knife, covered in blood, appeared to have been hastily discarded and damaged. The blade was dull, as if it had been used with force, but then quickly destroyed, possibly to erase any trace of a violent act. Brian had visited Home Depot and spent a small fortune on items designed to clean up a crime scene. The bloodstains in the basement and the damaged knife tied him to the crime in a way that no amount of lies or evasions could conceal. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, and with each new discovery, the portrait of Brian Walshe as an innocent husband and father began to crumble. His repeated attempts to dodge the investigators' questions and his increasingly erratic behavior made it clear. He was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. As the investigation intensified, the public's view of Brian began to shift. What had initially seemed like an unlikely story about a missing woman had now become a potential murder investigation. And Brian Walshe, the man who had once been seen as a grieving husband, was quickly becoming the prime suspect in a case that had turned far darker than anyone could have imagined. The clock was ticking, and every new piece of evidence brought them closer to uncovering the chilling truth behind Anna Walsh's disappearance. By the time the search team had gathered the evidence from Home Depot, the pressure was building. The suspicion surrounding Brian Walshe was undeniable, but investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed something solid, something irrefutable. The house, once a home filled with the echoes of family life, now felt like a crime scene waiting to be unraveled. The basement. It was the one area the investigators hadn't fully explored, and it was in this quiet, seemingly mundane space where the truth would finally begin to surface. When the team entered the basement, they didn't know what to expect, but what they found would change the entire course of the investigation. At first glance, the basement appeared to be just another storage space, boxes piled up, tools scattered about, but there was something out of place. A faint, almost imperceptible odor hung in the air. It was the kind of smell that might easily be overlooked, but not by seasoned investigators. They knew what it was. They had seen it before. Blood. A closer inspection revealed the telltale signs. Bloodstains, smeared and splattered across the concrete floor, and a trail leading toward the back of the room. It was a chilling discovery, but it wasn't the only shock waiting for them. On the floor, just near the wall, they found a knife. It was partially buried beneath a stack of old sheets, its blade darkened by dried blood. The knife was damaged, its edges dull, as though it had been used with force but then hastily discarded. It was a gruesome piece of evidence that spoke volumes without a word being said. Anna's blood. The same blood that had been found in the basement now on the knife. The realization was swift. Anna had been in this room, and something had happened here. The evidence no longer pointed to a missing person. It screamed that a crime had been committed, a violent crime. Brian Walsh's attempts to maintain his innocence were growing more and more futile. The walls were closing in around him, and this was the moment when he could no longer hide behind a veil of lies. The blood found in the basement was a smoking gun, evidence that could not be explained away by a simple disappearance. The police, now certain of the crime, began to piece together the timeline. The discovery in the basement aligned with the other inconsistencies in Brian's story. His alibi for January 1st was shaky, and now, with the blood and knife, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Brian had been involved in something terrible, something that had happened right in the very place he had once called home. But the deeper question remained: what had truly happened in those final moments with Anna? Was it a crime of passion? Or was it something even more calculated? As the investigation continued, more questions arose. Why had Brian felt the need to hide the evidence so desperately? Why hadn't he come clean from the start? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, where was Anna's body? The search in the basement was only the beginning. The investigators knew that they were now in a race against time to uncover the full extent of Brian's actions. But one thing was clear: Brian's carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. The more they uncovered, the more his world began to crumble around him. Brian Walsh's life, once built on lies and deception, was quickly unraveling, and with each new discovery, the truth was emerging in ways that he could no longer hide. The brutal reality of what had transpired in that basement, and the role Brian played in it, was becoming more apparent with every passing moment. The more the investigators delved into Brian Walsh's life, the more unsettling details began to surface. After the discovery of the blood and the damaged knife, something in the case clicked. The pressure was mounting on Brian. Every piece of evidence seemed to circle back to him, yet there was one final confirmation they needed: what had been going on inside his mind in the days leading up to Anna's disappearance. The answer was found not in his words, but in his search history. It wasn't an easy decision to examine Brian's devices, but as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the truth might be hiding there. Anna's body was still missing, and Brian's denials were becoming increasingly difficult to swallow. As they accessed his search history, what they found was both chilling and unmistakable. Brian's Google searches from the past few weeks painted a disturbing portrait. The phrases alone were enough to make the investigators stop in their tracks. "How long before a body starts to smell" was the first of many searches that stood out. The question was blunt, clinical, and incredibly telling. Was Brian preparing for something more sinister than a mere disappearance? Another search read, "Dismemberment and the best ways to dispose of a body." The sheer matter-of-fact nature of the query was shocking. It was as if he had been researching ways to erase all traces of a crime, a crime that, until now, had seemed too unimaginable to consider. This was no longer a case of a missing woman. It was a murder investigation, one where the prime suspect had already made the fatal error of trying to cover his tracks. But perhaps the most damning search came next. Can you be charged with murder without a body? The realization hit like a gut punch. Brian had been thinking ahead. He had already calculated how he could get away with killing Anna. His questions revealed a chilling sense of coldness, a man who was not only capable of violence, but also prepared to outsmart the justice system. The investigators now understood that this was no random crime. This was planned, premeditated, and Brian's attempt to cover up his tracks was more deliberate than anyone had imagined. Each new search term only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. The next search was for something more technical: how to remove traces of blood from a carpet. This, coupled with the blood found in the basement, made it clear. Brian had been researching ways to clean up after a violent act. Every move he made, every word he said, now seemed calculated to mislead, to cover up the reality of what had taken place in his home. The pieces were all falling into place. The blood, the knife, the cleaning supplies. Now the searches confirmed what the police had suspected all along. Brian Walshe wasn't just a man in distress. He was a man who had thought through every detail of his crime, and every attempt to distance himself from it had been carefully planned. The significance of these searches went beyond just incriminating him. They exposed the depths of his deceit and manipulation, and they also confirmed something even more terrifying. Brian had known exactly what he was doing. His questions weren't out of curiosity, they were part of a deliberate plan. With these discoveries, the police were now on solid ground. They had the evidence they needed to prove that Brian Walshe wasn't just a grieving husband searching for his missing wife. He was the man responsible for her death, and now the evidence was irrefutable. As the investigation moved forward, Brian's attempts to deny the truth became increasingly futile. The search history had uncovered the chilling truth about his intentions, but the greatest question still loomed large. Where was Anna? Had her body been hidden, disposed of in some remote location, as Brian's searches suggested? Or had he gone further, ensuring that she would never be found? For now, the search for Anna's body continued, but the case had already shifted irrevocably. The man who had once been seen as a husband in grief was now firmly in the role of the prime suspect. With every new discovery, the investigation inched closer to unraveling the full, horrific truth. As the investigation into Brian Walshe deepened, it wasn't just the evidence that was stacking up against him. The more the authorities dug, the more they realized that they were not dealing with a simple case of a missing person. They were unraveling a complex web of lies, and the key to unlocking the truth might lie in the most unexpected place: someone who had once been a part of Brian's life, but had been kept in the shadows. The unexpected ally came in the form of a former colleague of Brian's, someone who had known him before the public knew his face, before the charges of fraud had tainted his reputation. This colleague, a man named Robert, had worked with Brian during a time when Brian had been involved in a high-stakes art scam. Robert had never known Anna, but he had known Brian, and he had seen sides of him that few others had. It wasn't until Robert saw the growing media frenzy surrounding Anna's disappearance that he started connecting the dots. Something about Brian's behavior, his nervous energy, his inability to keep his story straight, it all seemed too familiar. Robert had witnessed similar behaviors when Brian had been involved in the shady dealings with the forged Andy Warhol paintings. The paranoia, the defensiveness, the constant need to control the narrative, it was all too much like the Brian he had known. One evening, as Robert sat alone in his apartment watching the news about Anna's disappearance, something clicked. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Brian just months before, a conversation that had seemed harmless at the time. Brian had spoken cryptically about starting over and putting things behind him, as though he were looking to escape the mess his life had become. Robert's gut told him that something wasn't right, that Brian had been hiding more than just his past crimes. The following day, Robert reached out to the authorities, reluctant at first, but eventually convinced that what he knew could help bring the truth to light. He didn't have hard evidence, but he had something perhaps more valuable: insight into Brian's psyche. What Robert revealed would send chills down the investigators' spines. Brian had been worried about Anna for some time, not because of anything related to her directly, but because she had started talking about her growing concerns. She had become suspicious of his behavior, particularly his ongoing secrecy about his past, and the shady business dealings that had hung over their marriage like a dark cloud. Robert revealed that Brian had spoken about Anna with an unusual bitterness, hinting that she might be the key to his downfall. He had expressed fears that she would ruin everything if she ever found out the full extent of his past and the lies he had been living. This revelation hit the investigators hard. It provided a clear motive. Brian wasn't simply trying to avoid losing his wife. He was trying to silence the one person who knew too much. The more they pieced together, the clearer it became that Brian had been slowly plotting the disappearance of his wife, all while keeping up the charade of a perfect family life. But Robert's testimony didn't stop there. He went on to describe a chilling conversation he had overheard one evening. Brian had been discussing the idea of removing the problem and the lengths he might go to if things became too complicated. Robert hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with the full context of Anna's disappearance, he realized the horror of what those words meant. This unexpected ally had given investigators something they had been missing, a window into Brian's troubled mind. It wasn't just about the physical evidence anymore. It was about understanding the psychology behind the man. Robert's revelations painted a portrait of a man capable of cold, calculated violence, someone who had been planning this all along. As the investigation continued to gain momentum, Brian's story was becoming more and more difficult to believe. The walls were closing in on him, and every step of the investigation seemed to reinforce the idea that Anna's disappearance wasn't the result of a random event or a simple mistake. It was the consequence of a deliberate and methodical plan. Now, with the truth slowly coming to light, the police could see that Brian wasn't just guilty of hiding Anna's whereabouts. He was the one responsible for her tragic fate. His former colleague had given them the final piece of the puzzle, an insight into the mind of a man who would stop at nothing to preserve his own secrets. With every passing day, the investigation grew stronger. The police were closing in, and Brian knew it. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before his facade would crumble completely. The investigation had entered a new and darker phase. The evidence was mounting against Brian Walshe, but the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Anna's body? With each new discovery, the suspicion surrounding Brian grew. Yet without the body, they couldn't fully close the case. But all of that was about to change. It was early in March 2023 when the breakthrough came. After weeks of searching, the police received a tip that led them to a remote area in the woods, not far from the Walshe residence. The location had been thoroughly checked before, but something, an overlooked clue, a hunch, had directed them back. They returned, combing through the dense underbrush with renewed determination. And then they found it. The body was dismembered, wrapped in plastic, and scattered across several locations. The grisly discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. It was no longer a case of a missing person. It was now a murder investigation, and the killer's attempt to hide the crime was painfully clear. Anna's remains were identified using DNA analysis, and the confirmation was immediate. The reality of what had happened hit the investigators hard. The peaceful suburban family that had once seemed so perfect was shattered by the revelation of brutal violence. But what shocked them even more was the extent of the lengths Brian had gone to erase all evidence of his crime. The manner in which Anna's body was disposed of suggested a deliberate effort to ensure she would never be found. It was an act of cold calculation, a methodical plan to destroy all traces of the woman who had once been his wife. The police were now dealing with not just a husband who had lied, but a man who had committed a horrific crime and had tried to cover his tracks in the most gruesome way possible. Brian had played his part in a twisted performance, deceiving the public, the investigators, and even his own family. But now the charade was over. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The blood in the basement, the knife, the Google searches, it was all leading to one conclusion: Brian was the murderer. But the body, though it confirmed the police's worst fears, raised more questions. How had Brian managed to keep up the lie for so long? The public had been fed a story about a grieving husband, a missing wife, and an innocent family, but now, all of that had crumbled. Brian's deceit was exposed in the most harrowing way possible. Anna's life had been brutally ended, and the world would now know the truth of what had happened behind the closed doors of their home. The bombshell of the discovery reverberated through the community. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues were stunned. How could someone they had known, someone they had trusted, be capable of such a horrific act? Brian Walsh's life had been built on lies, but now the truth was painfully clear. He had killed Anna, dismembered her body, and disposed of her remains like trash. The emotional toll on Anna's family was profound. Her mother and sister, still reeling from the disappearance, now had to confront the unimaginable truth that their beloved Anna had not just disappeared, she had been murdered. The pain of their loss was made all the more unbearable by the brutal nature of the crime and the shocking betrayal by someone they had once welcomed into their lives. As the news of the discovery spread, the case took on a new sense of urgency. Brian, now the prime suspect, was arrested, but despite the overwhelming evidence, he still maintained his innocence. The investigators knew, however, that the truth could no longer be denied. Brian Walshe had murdered Anna, and now it was time to make him face the consequences of his actions. The discovery of Anna's body marked a turning point in the case, but it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter in the quest for justice. The truth had been uncovered, but the fight was far from over. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Brian became stronger, and with the body now found, the wheels of justice began to turn with unstoppable force. Anna Walsh's life had been taken too soon, but her family would not let her death be in vain. They would fight for justice, and they would see that the man responsible for her murder was held accountable. As the trial of Brian Walshe began in the spring of 2023, the courtroom buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. What had begun as a quiet suburban mystery had now become a public spectacle. The murder of Anna Walshe had captivated the nation, and the quest for justice was about to unfold before the eyes of millions. The prosecution team presented a compelling case, meticulously weaving together the damning evidence that had been uncovered over the past months. The blood in the basement, the dismembered remains of Anna found in the woods, and the chilling Google searches made by Brian were all pieces of a puzzle that now painted a clear picture of cold, calculated murder. Brian's story, his desperate attempt to claim innocence, had been shattered by each new discovery. But the most powerful weapon in the prosecution's arsenal was the emotional testimony from Anna's family. Her mother, sister, and close friends took the stand, each one recounting the pain of losing Anna and the horror of realizing that the man they had trusted with her life was the one responsible for her death. Anna's mother, in particular, was a poignant figure in the courtroom. Her grief was raw, and her words left the jury and spectators alike in tears. She spoke of Anna's bright future, the love she had for her children, and the devastating void left in their lives after her daughter's brutal murder. Every word was a reminder that Anna was not just a victim in a police investigation. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and her life had been stolen by the man who had promised to love her. The prosecution's case was airtight, but Brian Walsh's defense team did everything in their power to cast doubt on the evidence. They attempted to argue that the bloodstains found in the basement were not a sign of murder, but rather an accident. They suggested that Brian's erratic behavior could have been the result of stress, not guilt. They even tried to paint Anna as a woman who had been difficult to live with, using her personal struggles to discredit her character. But these attempts to deflect were feeble at best. The evidence against Brian was overwhelming, and the jury could see through the defense's tactics. The most chilling aspect of the trial was Brian's continued denial. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the emotional testimony from Anna's family, Brian maintained his innocence. He had no explanation for his actions, no remorse for the life he had taken. His refusal to accept responsibility made it clear he was a man who would stop at nothing to protect himself, even at the expense of the woman he had vowed to love. As the trial progressed, the media frenzy only intensified. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to catch every moment of the drama unfolding within. The public was divided, some believing in Brian's innocence, while others were appalled by the calculated nature of the crime. The story had become more than just a courtroom battle. It had become a national obsession. Yet, despite the attention and the mounting pressure, Brian remained calm, almost too calm. His stoic demeanor made it difficult for many to grasp the full extent of the horror he had inflicted on his family. How could a man who had appeared so composed, so in control, be capable of such brutality? The answer, it seemed, was clear. Brian had been a master manipulator, able to hide his true nature behind a facade of charm and normalcy. But now, in the courtroom, that facade was crumbling. The defense's final attempt to create doubt hinged on Brian's emotional state. They argued that Brian had been under immense pressure with his criminal past weighing on him and the threat of losing his family. They tried to paint a picture of a man pushed to the edge, but the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen enough. The evidence, the testimony, and the sheer brutality of the crime spoke for itself. As the trial neared its conclusion, the focus shifted to the final argument, the search for justice for Anna. Her family had been through hell, and the trial was their chance to see the man who had taken their beloved daughter and sister held accountable. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Brian, but for the memory of Anna herself. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when they returned with their verdict, the room held its breath. Brian Walshe was found guilty of first-degree murder. The relief in the courtroom was palpable, but it was tinged with sadness. No verdict could bring Anna back, but at least there was closure. The justice she deserved had finally been served. In the end, the trial had been a battle for truth. It was a battle that had exposed the lies, the deceit, and the darkness within Brian Walshe's soul. And in the end, it was the truth that triumphed. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed back into the room. The decision had been made, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. Brian Walshe, once seen as a grieving husband, now stood before the court, facing the consequences of his horrific actions. The silence was deafening as the foreman stood to read the verdict. "Guilty," he said, his voice steady, but weighed with the gravity of the moment. A collective breath was exhaled, but it wasn't one of relief. It was one of finality. Justice had been served, but the loss was still too fresh, too raw. Brian's face remained impassive. The man who had once appeared so composed, now a hollow shell of the person he had portrayed to the world. His denial of guilt continued, but the overwhelming evidence, his actions, his lies, and the brutal truth left no room for doubt. Anna's family, sitting in the front row, clung to one another. Her mother's eyes were red, her face a mask of both grief and relief. The journey they had endured over the past months had come to an end, but the weight of what had happened was far from lifted. Anna was gone, and no verdict could bring her back. But at least, at long last, the truth had been acknowledged. The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers, the media buzzing with the revelation of the verdict. For many, the story was still too surreal to fully comprehend. How could someone like Brian, seemingly part of a perfect family, be capable of such an unimaginable act? How had the man they knew become the monster who had taken his wife's life? But the aftermath of the verdict was just beginning. The public's reaction was one of both shock and anger. There were those who had believed Brian's facade, the ones who couldn't fathom that a man they had admired could do something so dark. They had seen him as a father, a businessman, someone to trust. Now that image was shattered, leaving only the grim truth of his actions. For Anna's family, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Her mother, in particular, found herself torn between the justice that had been delivered and the overwhelming pain of losing her daughter. There would be no true sense of closure. No amount of justice could ever replace the emptiness left by Anna's death. Anna's children, too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, would grow up with a void in their lives. They would never know their mother's love, never feel the warmth of her embrace again. That loss would remain with them forever. Her legacy, however, would be one of strength, determination, and the love she had for them. The courtroom was filled with emotion, but as Brian was led away in handcuffs, his expression still devoid of remorse. The weight of his actions hung in the air. He had been sentenced to life in prison, and though his fate had been sealed, it felt hollow. The man who had planned, executed, and attempted to erase his crime would now face the rest of his life behind bars. But for those who had loved Anna, it was a hollow victory. In the aftermath of the trial, Anna's family vowed to honor her memory. They set out to raise her children with love and care, ensuring that they would never forget who their mother had been. Anna's name would live on in the hearts of those who knew her best, and though her life had been tragically cut short, her legacy would endure. Brian Walshe's conviction was a moment of justice, but it was not an ending. The scars left by his actions would remain for those who loved Anna. The grief and the pain would never fully fade, and the memory of what Brian had done would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the end, Anna's story was a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most seemingly perfect facades. And it was a stark warning that even the most trusted people can hide the darkest secrets. The search for justice, for truth, had been a long and painful journey, but it was a journey that ended with the verdict that Brian Walshe deserved. What do you think of Brian Walshe's actions and the tragic case of Anna Walshe? Do you believe the investigation uncovered all the dark truths behind this crime? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case as chilling as we did, make sure to hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories, investigations, and updates. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.